season of Malifaux last year and ready to get this new one started, which I'm very excited to do. And just generally in a good place, right? Hope life's treating you well. Something I wanted to try out a little bit for this year was to, as someone said, I think it might have been Oscar Wilde, though, you know, might also not have been. All artists steal, great artists steal from the best, and take an idea from someone who I think has shown that they're really good at thinking about the game in a very intricate and compelling way, and borrowing an idea from Maniacal Cackle and doing some recordings about my pregame impressions prior to playing some tournament games. So this is the first of those, assuming that it goes well. And I'm going to be talking about my matchup for the first round of the Good Anya Mate event with the charming Simon, one of a couple of nice Simons who are pretty good at Malifaux that we have on the circuit, who is a known McMourning enthusiast and unsurprisingly picked McMourning into me. I'm trying out Purple for the event, which is a faction that I don't have a ton of experience with. There aren't that many of those yet, though I guess I also don't have a ton of experience with almost anything. But because of a couple of considerations, there's an in-person tournament coming up at the end of January, Captain Con, that I hope to see some folks at, which is going to be built around a team event, which I'm very excited for. I love team events, but I think a neat restriction that was baked into that was that within one team, you weren't allowed to repeat a faction. And I had spent a fair amount of time and focus closing out last year, playing a lot of Elite and expanding out into playing some Guild generally. I had played Lucius in both factions a little, but really definitely was focusing more on Guild, and I had previously also played a little bit more Guild than I played Neverborn, but one of the people who I'm very happy to have on my team for the event, in Nathan, noted Guild enthusiast and mourner, I guess advocate, is going to be playing Guild, and it definitely made more sense for me to do something else because I sort of do something else all the time, and to have him stick to his strength. So I'm doing this. Anyway, so this is the pool and map that I have a kind of a rough deployment. This is not necessarily either going to be my deployment or exactly what I think Simon is necessarily going to do, but you can see the pool here over on the right. So this is a Flank Stuff the Ballots pool on this interesting newer map built around kind of the central structure. It's not incredibly terrain heavy, but it definitely has some obstructive stuff going on in the middle, and I actually, more of the newer maps have had more sort of like significant chunks of terrain that I think are designed to sort of like make for a make the terrain felt, which I think is totally fine. I think that's good. But with the pool then of Power Ritual, In Your Face, Outflank, Hold Up Their Forces, and Sweating Bullets. And I kind of expected that I was going to see something like what I've ended up had dropped into me in advance. This is something that folks who don't play a lot of competitive Malifaux, or probably particularly who don't play as much in digital events where people have, complete access to their factions if they want to use it, maybe aren't as accustomed to seeing, or wouldn't even necessarily have on their radar as a strategy. But there is a certain kind of pool online that is built with a lot of schemes that care about things like the cost of models, or the station of models, and have restrictions sort of based around you have to be cheaper than your opponent to score this, or your opponent has to be a henchman, or something like that, in order for you to even sort of qualify, sort of setting aside, actually scoring the scheme if it's on the table and then, feasible. That there are certain prerequisites that would essentially make it impossible to score the scheme at all. And this is, I think, a pool that has a lot of classic hallmarks of one of those, like, 7 or less, like, you can really potentially skew your build in a way that actually shuts off a lot of the pool, and potentially shuts off a lot of the pool that would otherwise be sort of naturally tempting to take. Right? So, a lot of the sort of level 1, I would kind of rather be doing this if I could get away with it, because there are certain schemes that I think are pretty common comfort picks, or just sort of perceived as generally more appealing or more consistent. And so Simon has, in building a crew that has no 8-cost models or more, obviously right away, fully taken away one of the points of in-your-face in the pool, which I think in-your-face would otherwise be up there as one of the sort of more conventionally appealing picks. And that's a delicate thing to do, because obviously if you go so cheap, so hard, you are potentially sort of blunting your ability to field your really highest impact models, and maybe making it so that in a lot of cases with a lot of crews, your prospects on attrition might be a little bit dubious. But it's definitely a strategy that you can consider, and sort of compounding that with, because Hold Up Their Forces is also in the pool, and I don't think Hold Up is necessarily as sort of universally almost anybody who's sort of running an effective crew might sort of consider or wants to take this option, like in your faces. Between the two of them, that's two schemes that do kind of reward you for skewing that way, and so it makes sense that Simon really went for it pretty hard. Then on top of that, you have Sweating Bullets, which was a scheme that I think I, from personal experience, really rated early in this GG. It seems like a very natural. Well, of course, people sort of go to the middle. And I think there's been a bit of a sort of seesaw, or sort of a course correction of early on in GG4, when people were still really not at all adjusted away from GG3. There were some schemes, and I think Sweating might be the first among them, that I think were a little bit more desirable, because they sort of fit the mentality of, we're going to meet, in the sort of 6-inch radius around the center of the board, and we're going to interact there, and that's going to sort of be defining for the game. That would have made more sense in a lot of GG3 pools. And then there was a big shift away from that, as I think people more thoroughly internalized the, like, we saw this as a return to a more schemy GG, though I'm saying this in part sort of from what I've heard and sort of impressions from other people, because I really didn't play Malifaux at all before GG3. I'm not that new to the game anymore, but I'm not that old in it, I guess, either. But over time, I think we've sort of come back around to, yeah, but interacting effectively via combat is still really powerful. And especially if you are doing so in a way that is really shutting your opponent off of points very effectively. It might be a GG that wants you to be a little bit more capable of sort of scoring and moving and doing non-combat stuff. But if you are still sort of equipped to score a reasonable number of points and are really shutting your opponent off of a lot of their scoring by killing stuff, or at least putting them in a position where they can't sort of ignore combat, right? Like if they try to sort of sell out for scoring, they'll die too quickly. That's a pretty effective way to win. And so, anyway, the moral of that story is that I don't really like Sweating Bullets anymore, because I don't necessarily assume that there are going to be qualifying models, or that they're going to be where they ought to be. And I think actually, in a bit of self-reflection, I probably need to get a little bit better about respecting it more, because I think the sort of like degree to which it's sort of fallen off of my radar means I don't necessarily think as much as I should about the possibility that other people have taken it. And so I give it up when I don't need to. Anyway, but so those are all now schemes that are really, at least for In Your Face or Sweating Bullets, right? Really just 1-point schemes, realistically. based on the build that I'm running into. And in both cases, they might be more sort of realistic 1 point schemes than you sometimes see. And so if this is going to be a low scoring pool anyway, I think there is a strong argument on my part and also on Simon's for us to sort of take a hard look at schemes that we might really not have any realistic hope of scoring multiple points on, kind of just accepting that, sure, but like if it's a race to 5 or a race to 6, locking in that 1 point might actually be pretty desirable. But anyway, so what I'm seeing from Simon is, I think, a crew that is really designed to try to narrow down what I can realistically do in the pool. And then it's bringing some tools that I think are contesting some of the sort of remaining options in the pool, or certainly are threatening to. And then I think it's also a crew that is responding to the expectation that Titania tends to be Titania 1 and is often played as a pretty aggressive master. And so that's sort of doubling down on the, if you think your opponent is playing this sort of tanky dive master who gets into the thick of it and does a lot of fighting and tries to do a lot of damage, then all the more reason to just take In Your Face, for example, off the table, right? Because Titania 1, if there's a valid target on the board, is probably happy to try to chase it down and spend a lot of the game scoring that, right? Like that's kind of consistent with what she'd be doing anyway. So what came out then is definitely a crew on Simon's part that is going to make it hard for me to put up a lot of points easily, and certainly is sort of pushing me away from schemes that I might otherwise gravitate towards, or I would, right? I do like taking In Your Face a decent amount when it's available, for example. None of that was a huge surprise to me, and while I didn't go as hard into denying in my own build, so we can sort of take a look at the two builds here. So this is Simon. The two Gwison are definitely, I think, in part, probably a hedge against the kind of aggression from something like Titania 1 that I was describing, right? Gwison are certainly fairly unappealing models to attack, and for somebody like Titania, who has a lot of health, but does damage reliably, but like without, I mean, she's sort of the Frank of masters, where she's essentially trying to Mancho just with volume. Something like Gwison can make that start to be a little bit unappealing. And the other big thing that, or the other couple, I think, of significant things that we're seeing from Simon here are the concentration of lower cost models, both making Hold Up challenging, which I think I mentioned Hold Up, but that's definitely a scheme in the pool that is sort of worth focusing on too, because we both are definitely factoring Hold Up into our decision making and what we decided to bring. So Simon is, I think, trying reasonably here to make Hold Up pretty difficult on my part, especially if I was skewing really towards the like all the knights thing, which if I were sort of juking but not really juking might be, you know, the people don't like Titania 2 very much, but like to the extent that like there are sort of established thoughts on her, like, wow, she makes Autumn Knights pretty tanky is definitely one of those. And so everything 6 cost is like, okay, well, I might not have a realistic hope of killing those knights, but like they're also not set up to score one of the natural points that you would want. So I think we're seeing that here. And we're also seeing a lot of terrain mitigation, both for the board and because of my marker theme, right? The fact that I'll create a lot of difficult terrain. And then finally, I think some attempt to contest a couple of the remaining points left in the pool in Outflank and Power Ritual, which are weirdly redundant. Not weirdly. I think that's almost sort of building towards the another thing about the World Series experience that I think can take a little bit of getting used to when you're first getting into it, and feels very World Series. It's a thing about a pool that, like, when I look at it and I evaluate it and I think about building and then I sort of like play, is a very sort of it's almost comforting now because I've done this enough that I'm like, yep, that's the World Series. I know that it's just like the pool invites people to make these kinds of decisions to sort of like get advantages by sort of engaging with the game. in sort of like all of its phases, right, prior to actually playing and in sort of planning and sort of developing your approach and then executing on table. That the pool is sort of this split between these very kind of like cost restrictive, like you can kind of shut this off with design, and then a couple of schemes that are pretty difficult to score together because they kind of want the same models to be in the same spots, and they're pretty AP intensive, right? Like both Outflank and Ritual require you to get pretty far afield, even on flank, and then of course have the markers. And so I think the final thing that is sort of being built into the shutdown kind of all defense all the time thing here is the like Gwison and Trail of Gore and like not elite anti-scheme marker technology, but like definitely some amount of like we're going to try to get out there and we're going to try to make those points very difficult to score as well. Okay, so I, like I said, was not surprised exactly by any of that because I think that's sort of a natural way to sort of build to this pool, and I think that is a way to also build to the pool if you think by default that your role in the matchup is to be reactive and to sort of borrow terminology, right? If you think I'm the beatdown, right? I'm the one who's going to fight, and Simon is not necessarily that optimistic about sort of a grindy, like, let's duke it out game if things go that way, but also not that necessarily interested in facilitating that. And of course, because McMourning builds in a certain amount of summoning, might be sort of happy by default to say, if we kind of just play slow and this is a kind of a more prolonged game, and a game that's more focused on sort of positioning and setting up for scoring early, then that would favor me. Then building a crew that's going to make it very difficult for me to like score points without sort of like having to kind of deal with that sort of defensive tech makes a certain amount of sense. So I think you could possibly critique the build for going too far in that direction, because obviously it wanted to keep its its hiring costs low to sort of achieve all of that, but it might have sort of skewed into kind of passive to a fault of its very light on the ability to do damage. Obviously, it can summon some flesh constructs that are okay for fighting, right? They have a reasonable melee, and they can take a fair number of attacks because of their ability to get fast. But other than that, there are some severe 5s, right? Gwison can potentially hit reasonably hard, but there are 2 stat 6 damaging attacks in the crew, right? One of them is on McMourning, and it doesn't have a track, and the other is Oscar, who is a pretty tough 7-stone henchman, but I think enforcer, but is probably more notable just for hanging around, right? And it occurs to me also in deployment that I don't know if he's actually going to, Simon is going to play too hard to sort of facilitate this, but I sort of just defaulted to this crew is going to need to get its tanky stuff kind of out into spots to be interacting with the strat, and kind of forcing me to care about their sort of defensive qualities. And that sort of meant that Oscar kind of wanted to get out there, but obviously Oscar sort of wants to be around McMourning for a card. I don't know if that's actually a good idea in this one, and that's that'll be an interesting thing to see, because I kind of figure McMourning wants to be a little bit more central. He's not trying to get up the board super quickly. He's trying to do his engine stuff for at least a while, and I do think also I have the one Gwison, right, kind of protecting Zeke, trying to sort of serve its defensive purpose in the middle here. I do think that there is some risk on Simon's part of if he tries to use his defensive tools to maximum potential, essentially just sitting on his hands and letting me do too much and sort of score too much without actually really accomplishing a lot with that defense, because it doesn't really matter how hard it is to sort of eliminate these key models if I'm not trying to, and the ability to do so isn't really that essential to either person's win conditions. Yeah. Anyway, so more focusing on me then, I didn't necessarily try to sort of hard call that I thought that this was going to be an under 8 build on Simon's part, though I definitely did sort of consider that as a reasonable possibility when I was building. But I figured that I was pretty sure I was going to see McMourning, and I think McMourning was going to be a little bit slower in this matchup. And on this pool, that McMourning is probably content to sort of think he's okay operating as the sort of like value engine. Like you have to kind of get up and sort of interfere with what I'm doing, right? Like I want to goldfish, you need to stop me from goldfishing. That I figured I could try to find a happy medium of not totally hard denying some of those same schemes. So obviously in my build, I have a couple of models that are valid targets for in your face, right? And I think this is even more true than I thought it might be based on what Simon has chosen to bring. I still think in your face is going to be a really hard scheme for Simon to happily pick because he's not very well equipped to do damage, right? Like Killjoy is actually not that durable, I don't think. Though I've come around to I like Killjoy after the changes that were made to the model more than I thought I did. At first I thought I really didn't like the model. But Killjoy isn't trivial, at least to kill, has a reasonable amount of healing, and when you would struggle to kill anything, it is a bit of an ask. Vasilisa is kind of durable, sort of contextually durable, but the big challenge with Vasilisa is not necessarily going to be getting up into the line of fire that aggressively early, and I have no reason to play either model in a way that facilitates in your face, which is to say I really actively shouldn't keep them close enough to Titania to make scoring available. And if McMourning isn't pushing up there, which he doesn't want to, right, sort of already covered, I don't think McMourning is a frontliner here, it seems like it is a very likely 1-point scheme at best for Simon as well, with the caveat that I think Simon's prospects of having Oscar to survive to get and stay in my deployment zone are meaningfully worse than my odds of the same with Killjoy in his. So, sort of similarly, I think kind of in a rough spot there. Weirdly, I think is worse at hold up your forces than I am, because I did sort of swerve enough, and I have, particularly in the sort of corrupted hound engine, assuming I get a couple of them out, which I'll sort of talk about that in a sec, but if I can get a couple of corrupted hounds, those are probably better at scoring hold up against basically everything in Simon's crew than Simon's crew is into mine. The Gwison can definitely try to sort of like push up and like go bother my 7-cost models, which Simon maybe thought I was going to have more of than I did. And so I basically think we're probably both looking to play for hold up. That seems like sort of an obvious and probably still a correct choice on both of our parts. I think that build-wise, Simon is maybe not quite as much ahead on that, but sort of by default, as this build is expecting going in, right? This is a build that's like, I think I'm going to be really good at hold up, and I'm not going to be good for hold up, and I think it's kind of okay at both once the dust is settled. So I definitely think I am strongly considering hold up. The only real sort of downside to hold up for me, normally one of the downsides to hold up is you'd want to kill models for qualifying purposes. I do kind of want to kill the Gwison. I actually think they're not as hard to kill when I sort of... Gwison are a model that I do think benefit from the fact that people know that they're such a pain to kill for their cost, and sort of they sort of have that reputation of like, God, these things are so annoying to deal with. And I think actually that artificially adds a little bit to their durability, because you can just math them down even if it can cost you. And notably, armored models are a little bit better at doing that. And so while I don't get the real sort of added efficiency of, for example, if the Weird Wood is fighting a Gwison, I can't do damage, take damage, and then bleed on it and really like burn it down, because Black Blood doesn't work that way, right? I'm still only taking the 1 in return, and those add up, right? If you've played into Urami or just generally into Vengeance models, right? Like, it does have a meaningful effect on attrition, but that kind of gets back to that kind of requires further attrition, I think, to be fully paid off on, and we'll see how much sort of real offense is being mustered here. So I think I probably am priced into picking one of Power Ritual or Outflank here. I think that's presumably one of the desired effects of Simon's build, but I think just because it's sort of what I'm being kind of led to do doesn't necessarily mean that I am supposed to or even kind of allowed to not do it. I do have pretty reasonable tools for it in that I think I have decent mobility, especially on the flank where the hounds are hopefully operating. So while that may be a 1-point scheme, though with Power Ritual, the real risks that you can run, unless you are really dealing with something that shuts down markers, are really sort of built around losing a flank hard, and so just kind of having that area of the board be so fully shut off that you just can't even imagine getting over there to try to score. You're just like, I don't have a model within a country mile, and if anything tried to spend multiple turns to get over there, it would just die. That seems less likely to happen here because Simon's crew is okay for mobility and not great for damage, and I think between the two of those, I'll probably be able to hang around and manage that. Which one I take is sort of an interesting question because they feel very similar in what is required. The difference, of course, being Outflank requires you to have models on both flanks, but Power Ritual requires you to ultimately sort of like be a little bit better with markers, I guess, essentially. This in trying to sort of describe the two of them, I am probably working around to, I guess, even though the fact that this is a flank deployment with strategy markers on the far flanks, and so there are some pretty strong incentives to get out there, it might still be right to do Power Ritual, because even when you are kind of looking to get out to the flanks anyway, Power Ritual might sort of just be a mostly more straightforward version of the same. I don't think I'm taking both. I think taking both is in theory, you have the synergy of the same models can kind of qualify. Though obviously Power Ritual doesn't care about the models, just the markers. But the logistics for the markers, I think, is very demanding. Anyway, so I'm choosing one of those. I think I am accepting the sort of success of the McMourning crew design and not taking in your face. I think it is reasonable for me to view that as a 1-point scheme if I want to baby Killjoy a little bit, just sort of make sure there aren't issues there, but I think I can do better than that. I don't think Killjoy is such a juggernaut and so mobile that it's just guaranteed to happen anyway. And if it's not guaranteed to happen anyway, I don't really see why I should be settling that way. Sweating Bullets, I think, is a better 1-point pick if I want one, because I think McMourning is possibly not trying to get into position for that anyway. It is obviously something that if I hadn't revealed one of my schemes on the last turn, it would probably be right to sort of think of and maybe even assume that it was the 1-point Sweating Bullets pick, and try to get McMourning there to deny it. I should definitely similarly be thinking about Titania and try to position her so that I can do the same if I don't know what one of Simon's schemes is by the end of the game. That's probably what it will be. But I think realistically, the combination of Hold Up and one of the 2 marker schemes is the sort of proper blend here. And the tension then is really just that some of the same models are kind of being asked to pull double duty, right? And that if the hounds are so good for Hold Up, the hounds are also going to be pretty helpful for having the mobility to get out and score whatever marker scheme that is. But if I have enough of them, which gets to some of the variants that I'm kind of signing up for in my list, but if I have enough of them, that probably is ultimately feasible. So in that, I think I like my spot in this game. I think essentially I ended up on kind of the more mid-range of I'm playing some to deny some of the pool, but without blunting sort of my own tools quite as much. And I think in a dynamic where sort of both lists sort of skewed in that direction, the one that did so in a way that maybe isn't quite as sort of effective in sort of like hard denial, but is also not really giving up as much, is probably I think that's the choice, the position that you would prefer to be in, because you are going to be struggling to score uphill, but your opponent gave up a lot in their tools, and so they are as well. And really so in that you're probably both about as poor at point scoring, and you're just sort of more generally effective. That's my hope anyway. Obviously, we'll see. Just a final thing is I do want to note, and so this is kind of my just admitting in advance I'm aware of this, and obviously if it comes back to haunt me, then, well, I was warned. My crew is definitely building some of its power into the fact that it has a fair amount of summoning available to it. So the Wicked Doll is a pretty good model in its own right, considering how cheap it is, right? It's stealth, it has creep along. It's significant. It's 3 stones. If that's really all there was to say about it, that would already be, I think, enough to say. But the Weirdwood unlocks the ability to get a fair amount of puppet summoning off, even with relatively little scrap, which it's not like Simon is going to be giving me a ton of scrap in this game, right? I guess the Curator could drop one, but I'm either making my own or I'm not going to have access to it generally. So that the fact that the Weirdwood essentially refunds you a scrap, potentially it could refund you more than one, but often I think it would be better to, if I kill the doll turn 1 and I can summon 2, ideally stitched, turn 1, I think it's better to give up on the long-term benefit of continuing to recycle the scrap and having sort of a stream of stitched, to just be immediately in a spot where I have 2 stitched without slow and that are sort of scheme relevant as of turn 2. And the same thing with dogs, right? I summon dogs on a 6, and stitched on 9s. I guess in theory I could summon other models on lower numbers for Vasilisa. The big issue with all of this, right, is that I'm summoning with a minion and an enforcer, and so while these are not major TNs, they are suited values that I can't bake in. So I have mathed this out a little bit. This is not a thing I do a ton for Malifaux, but if you are interested in sort of exploring sort of the probability of certain outcomes like this in Malifaux, a tool that's really handy that is used in other contexts, like it's used a lot in Magic, is what's called a hypergeometric calculator. You can just search that and you'll be directed to some tools, and it's a way to basically just calculate with a certain sample size. So for Malifaux, it's the size of your deck, and a certain number of looks. So usually that's sort of described in terms of a sample size, right? How large a portion of the total are you being exposed to for the purpose of calculation. It gives you the odds of your encountering, either a single sort of successful result, right, depending on how many there are, out of that sample from the total, or multiple, etc. It basically just tells you the odds that you'll have, for example, in this case, a 9 of masks or better in your hand, with, whatever sort of draw you have to sort of expose yourself to cards on the first turn, or a given turn, whatever. And so in mathing it out, the sort of short version is I'm certainly not guaranteed to be able to summon incredibly consistently. The odds are not bad. I'm certainly a significant favorite to be able to summon at least one of both models on turn 1. If I'm willing to essentially invest any qualifying card, which is another thing that I think I'm a little bit more willing to be aggressive in the context of this screw and throw away, for example, like a 12, even a 13, especially to summon a Stitched, even though that might sound weird to you. Because I think ultimately in the long run, in the context of like this kind of matchup, the Stitched is just going to be better than any sort of individual 13. It's not like I use 13s that well anyway. So all that is to say, there might be a moral to the story if you've watched this and you've seen the game that followed it up, right? The game itself. And I never summoned anything, or my summoning was really pretty muted, that I ended up on kind of the poor side of variance. And that's sort of unlucky, but it's also part of what I was signing up for, right? Like, I have the ability to get pretty unlucky. And it's not like a 2% chance. It's low but meaningful. So there's definitely a my crew could fail on its own aspect to all of this, which I guess makes it a little bit more sort of dramatic as well. I think it should be a good game. Please let me know what you think about these.